I have no prelude. I'm actually going to go straight into this because the women who I found in the archive have touched me in such a way that I can't, off the fly, just read their stories. I have to actually tell you about them, how I read them and how they occurred, right? Okay. In the decade prior to the abolition of slavery in Brazil, violent episodes in the lives of enslaved women were frequently documented in newspapers across Rio de Janeiro and nearby provinces. Women appeared in newspaper articles as disfigured and monstrous, augmenting abolitionist storylines centered on spectacles of violence. Enslaved women's interactions with police after violent domestic scenes formed an entire genre of stories defined by graphic details of these women's lacerations and their intended refuge, actually, in police stations. This paper examines the role of the police and the press in scenes of violence endured by enslaved women in 19th century Brazil. Using reports from Brazilian newspapers, I analyzed how enslaved women's interactions with the police implicated the police state in the domestic sphere of master-slave relations, while simultaneously forging the illusion of the state as potential savior, an illusion largely produced by the press. Enslaved women went to police stations seeking sanctuary, yet they ended up further injuring themselves or receiving further injury when the press published their accounts or when the same authorities incarcerated them. I argue that enslaved women used their scarred flesh as evidence of the violence imposed on them, yet ultimately, and perhaps intentionally, gaining the attention of the press and the public in an increasingly abolitionist society. So this paper reconfigures how feminist theorists and activists think about the criminalization of Black women from a transnational and transhistorical standpoint. I argue that the treatment of Black women in prisons post the age of law and order extends from a history of carcerality that began way before the period of enslavement even ended. In the last few decades of enslavement in Brazil, stories about enslaved women in Brazilian newspapers were almost always exclusively confined to the section on prisons, and any other stories featuring enslaved or Black women framed them under the discourses of derangement and vagrancy. I ultimately argue that the configuration of Black female criminality has been a historical and transnational process, and that any contemporary abolitionist attempt has to answer to the history of Black female criminalization within the history of Black enslavement. Enslaved women in Brazil participated in a number of everyday resistances, including running away, committing suicide and infanticide, or killing their masters and their masters' children. Gazeta da Tarde, or afternoon newspaper entry from 1880, tells the tale of an enslaved woman named Catarina, who after suffocating her two daughters, one 2 years old and the other 4 years old, put an end to her own existence when she choked herself to death near the house where she lived. Another entry from 1882 tells us of an enslaved woman who, after beaten by her mistress, killed herself through asphyxiation. Enacting the nullification of their slave condition by getting rid of the most basic condition of enslavement, life, gave many enslaved women the choice to transition out of one life, out of this enslaved life, to one that is free. For these women, taking their own lives and the life of their children was an act of repossessing one's body and progeny. The violent lives of enslaved women are at the center of my exploration, and yet writing their lives becomes injured and fractured because of their mutilated historicity, that is, the violent condition in which enslaved women appear in the archive, disfigured and violated, as Marisa Fuentes reminds us. These women become legible and relevant to the masculinist archive only by way of the violence that has been inscribed upon their bodies, both through those who inflicted the violence in their bodies and the archive that has captured only these deeply violent traces of women's lives. The masculinist archive on enslaved women is therefore not only a collection of stories of violence, but the violent and fragmented reproduction of these women's lives. These women's bodies became a social hieroglyph, forming what Fuentes has described as a landscape wherein the scars turned into enslaved women's stories, symbols of the deep penetration of violence that marks the relationship between the body and the archive, the body in the archive, the material body, and the enslaved female body in space. So a lot of women ended up going to the police to seek refuge from their masters, but a lot of masters ended up ordering the police to beat these women while enslaved, while in prison, and the women were imprisoned themselves. Yet, the unlikelihood of attaining recompense or justice did not stop enslaved women in Brazil from enacting everyday resistances, such as going to the police station, screaming, or running away from agents of public penitence. These women's attempts at achieving relative, albeit ephemeral and fleeting, protection from the violence of their masters suggest that these women saw themselves as agents of their own protection and masters of their own bodies, if only for a few minutes. The violent scenes by which women are inscribed into the archive fragment and curb our entry into their lives and their entry into ours. Enslaved women's lives are brutalized in the archive by way of the narrow threshold of legibility by which they are inscribed in it. The horizon of what was considered grievable was a narrow category of what would garner public attention, pity, or mere discomfort. And when these women were rendered legible and therefore grievable by the white liberal class, it was because of enslaved women's own disruptive presence within white and masculinist geographies and epistemes of power. These geographies have therefore created an archive that is equally burdened by the epistemic limits through which it is produced. But we must acknowledge, enslaved women during the last 8 years of formal slavery in Brazil were hardly wondering whether their actions would come to affect the so-called archive. And it is out of an effort to further elaborate on the history of enslaved women's own efforts towards their liberation that scholars bring these cases to light today. Enslaved women in Brazil often sought liberation through their own hands, notwithstanding the limitations of their legibility, the infrequent and hollow ways in which enslaved women's bodies could be read as grievable by the general public, and of the narrow yet tangible opportunity at achieving temporary respite.